You see, on the atheist side, they can't say that evil actually exists.
I beg to differ, sir.
Hello, everyone. I'm Professor Plank. I respond to various theological and ideological questions and claims from a rationalistic and naturalistic approach in an effort to give and explain the opposite viewpoint and help to balance the conversation. So, Charlie Kirk has been assassinated while on stage at Utah Valley University in Orem, Utah, just a few days ago. Now, to start off with, I am a pacifist, and I abhor violence in practically any form. Added to that, I'm staunchly against the death penalty, and I'm anti-war, so suffice it to say, I don't believe that anyone deserves to die for virtually any wrongdoing. And while I disagreed with Charlie on practically everything he ever said, the last thing I would ever wish on an ideological opponent is the kind of terrible violence that he suffered on that stage. At the end of the day, he was a human being with many people who knew him personally and loved him who are emotionally shattered at his loss. And we should always be empathetic about that and the loss that his death is. That being said, while I don't believe in violence, especially political violence, I also don't believe in sanitizing the legacy of people who did and said terrible things just because they've died, in a very let us not speak ill of the dead kind of a mindset. His rhetoric appealed to the worst aspect of people's psyches. The mistrustful, paranoid, jingoistic, xenophobic, othering of everyone who is even remotely different from myself and demonizing them for being so, aspects of people's darkest natures. And maybe what was even worse than that was that he did it in a way that made people see their bigotry as a virtue. He made people feel wise for believing that a woman's place was in the home, barefoot and pregnant and waiting on her husband hand and foot, little more than a good little servant and breed mare for the in-charge man of the house. He made people feel smart for looking at any non-white person with a respectable position in society with suspicion that they're automatically unqualified and intrinsically less than their Caucasian counterparts. Also implying that black people are the primary perpetrators of violence, thereby dog-whistling that it was an intrinsic aspect of black people in general. And where it impacts my channel and the theological focus that I tend to have, he was a Christian nationalist who believed that the United States should be run as a Christian theocracy, where the rights and abilities of non-Christians, whatever stripe they may be, would be marginalized, and laws would be passed with a view towards legal establishment of Christian ideology. And this just scratches the surface of the political, social, and cultural wasteland of a mindset that Kirk had and propagated all the days of his adult life. And one of the many, many groups of people who Kirk thought shouldn't exist are atheists like myself. And just a couple weeks ago, Kirk tackled the notion of atheism while talking about the recent gun violence that occurred at Annunciation Catholic Church and School in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He's going to be talking about why he believes in God and Christianity, and why atheists have the more untenable position. And while it may be a bit gauche to argue with the dead, bad ideas are bad ideas, regardless of the status of the person who made them. So let's not shy away from the kind of nonsense that Kirk said that ended up being some of his final arguments in this world, and take a look at what he had to say. But before we get to that, if you end up liking what you see in this video and would like to help out the channel, make sure to subscribe and click the bell so you'll always be notified when new content comes out. Check out my social media, including my Patreon, Twitter, and Blue Sky, all linked in the description. And of course, like this video, pop it a comment. All that goes a long way towards pleasing the YouTube algorithm, that wonderkind who wistfully watches as we wander, weighing worldly wonders without wanton worshipping wishes. We work within, weaving a worthy, wonderful world, while worshippers wobble wonkily without wit or wisdom. May it keep my channel motoring along. Now on to today's video.
So let's first go to what we as Christians, or Jews, but what ethical monotheists, we have the problem of evil. Atheists have evil no problem. You see, on the atheist side, they can't say that evil actually exists, because without God, if God does not exist, then we are nothing more than just a clump of cells, and there is no such thing as evil.
So Kirk does a clever little bait and switch here. He was originally asked and is supposed to be responding to how he can believe in God, especially in the wake of the kind of violence that occurred in Minneapolis. And while he quickly alludes to the notion that theists have the problem of evil to contend with, he quickly pivots to the notion that atheists can't even believe in the very idea of evil in the first place. A common apologist bullshit line of reasoning that we've heard again and again. But by focusing on what he perceives to be a flaw in atheistic thinking, he can put all the burden on atheism and basically just fall back on not only theism, but Christian theism as the default position, in light of his supposed dismantling of atheism. None of this actually addresses the question of why believe in God, or more specifically, why to believe in the Christian God. Attempt to take apart atheism all day, and you still haven't come any closer to addressing why you do believe in the God that you claim to believe in.
You only know something is evil if you have good to compare it to. You only know something is right because you have a standard of right.
I'll actually agree with Kirk here. I guess a broken clock can be right twice a day. Good and evil are subjective terms that can only be assigned in relation to one another. Much like, say, big and small. Something is only big or small in relation to something else. A mouse may seem quite small, unless you compare it to an atom, then it's massively large. But a mouse would be small compared to, say, the planet. Hot and cold, the same thing there. 0 degrees Celsius may seem cold at first glance until you compare it to 0 degrees Kelvin. Then it's significantly hotter. Likewise, good and evil are relative terms that can only be assigned as such if you're comparing them to something. And yes, that would require a standard. Now, where Kirk is going wrong, however, is in assuming that without a religion-imposed, and ultimately believed to be a God-imposed standard of good and evil, then there can be no standard of any kind, which is an incredibly silly notion.
We only know that something is evil and wrong because we have a transcendent standard to compare it to. If you do not believe in God, it is not right and wrong. It's nothing more than preferences.
And here's specifically where Kirk goes wrong, with his insistence that the standard for right and wrong needs to be a transcendent standard, and that no other kind of standard even exists or ever could exist. The only thing you need to form a moral framework is some standard, with no respect to where you got that standard from. You can get that standard any way you like, and it still forms the basis of one's personal moral framework. Take secular humanism, for instance. The base standard for right and wrong is human flourishing. This is an ethical system in which actions are judged as right and wrong based on whether they contribute to or detract from the well-being, happiness, and flourishing of humanity at large. This is often determined through reason, compassion, and scientific inquiry, as well as a lot of other ways that you try to determine what will and will not benefit human flourishing. But it all comes back to that idea of benefiting human flourishing. That is the base standard. It means that morality is not based on a set of divine commandments, but is instead a human construct aimed at improving the human condition and reducing suffering. Another example of a different secular moral framework is Kantianism. It's a secular philosophy that sets as its basis for morality the idea of categorical imperatives. Unlike ethical systems that judge actions by their consequences, Kant's philosophy is a deontological framework. This means that an action's morality is determined by whether it aligns with a fundamental moral duty or a rule, regardless of the outcome. The categorical imperative is that unconditional moral law that must be followed by all rational beings in all situations. It's an absolute and universal command. And that's very different from appealing to a particular outcome like human flourishing as secular humanism did. But both still getting their moral framework and their basis for right and wrong from something other than a transcendental or supernatural command. Still, another way that one could form their moral framework is on the basis of hedonism, or the idea that one's own pleasure and fulfillment is the highest good for that person. Therefore, their moral framework would be that anything they desire is good and right, and anything that goes against their desires is wrong and evil. Now, the typical theistic mindset is that morality has been established by God and what commands that God supposedly made, as passed down and filtered through their religion of choice, and that is the moral standard to be followed. As well as often believing that that same morality has been written on all of our hearts, as is often the line that apologists like to use. So that we instinctively know right from wrong based on that moral reality that God has made and put into each and every one of us. But all of these different bases and moral framework are all just doing the same thing. They are choosing a standard to apply in developing a person's moral framework. The thing is, the theist and the atheist do pretty much the same thing where developing their sense of right and wrong are concerned. Kirk says that without God, right and wrong are just preferences. But no, see, even with an appeal to a God, all theists are setting their morality by way of their preferences, just the same way atheists are. That's why no Christian today gives a rip about not eating shellfish, even though their faith tells them that it's morally wrong to do so. Even though that is an aspect of the faith that many Jewish people still attend to today. And though Christianity grew out of Judaism and has the same 10 Commandments and most all of the same beliefs, that's one that most modern Christians and non-adherent Jews have decided that they don't like, so it doesn't apply, based on preference. Christians will eat a shrimp cocktail and nary will it enter their mind that they even might be doing something immoral, based on the supposed transcendent standard of right and wrong from God himself. That's also why Christians don't engage in slavery, even though it is repeated many times, even in the New Testament, that slaves should be loyal and obedient to their human masters. It's not just that modern Christians don't follow many of these practices and standards of their own faith anymore out of some kind of cultural evolution that left said practices behind. They actively believe many of the things that the Bible proclaimed as good and righteous to in fact be wrong and immoral. Or would Kirk have been okay with his son being taken to the city walls to be stoned to death for being stubborn and rebellious as it was laid out in Deuteronomy? I mean, what does a person of faith do if they find that the church that they attend changes under some new leadership and find that the teachings and sermons of that new leadership no longer appeal to them? What do? They find a different church and a different congregation that more accurately reflects their mindset. This is why people change denominations, because they prefer the way another denomination interprets the religious standard. This is why people can and do switch entire faiths, because they prefer the way right and wrong is interpreted by a different religion altogether than the one they were raised under. The reality is, everyone sets their morality based on their preferences. The only difference between the atheist and the theist in this regard is that atheists are honest enough to admit that they're doing so, while theists delude themselves into believing that they're adhering to a divine, transcendent notion of right and wrong, written by God herself and handed down from on high. Well, Kirk, that's
stupid! You're so stupid!
Now, in my theology, I believe that you're able to choose. Other Christians do not have the belief as much in free will. They sort of do. It's hotly debated.
Ah, yes, that would be the Calvinist position. The belief that, because of the fall of man, non-saved people are unable to choose God or desire salvation on their own. Their will is kind of free in the sense that they can make choices, but those choices are always aligned with their sinful nature. They are free to choose what they want, but what they want is always going to be against God. It's an absolutely fucked in the head way of thinking, but frankly, I find it odd that any Christian can believe in free will while simultaneously believing in an all-knowing God. This was always one of the things that led me to the conclusion that the entire Christian mindset was absolutely cooked right from the start, because it's absolutely a part of the notion of a triomni God, that being a God who's all-powerful, all-good, and all-knowing, that all-knowing part includes perfect, unfailing knowledge of everything that will ever happen. Perfect 100% predictive power of the future. This is why God can supposedly give the power of prophecy to his chosen prophets, because he's giving them a tiny taste of the predictive power that God himself possesses. But then, if God knows with 100% accuracy everything that will ever happen, including every choice you or anyone else will ever make, then how can one possibly have real, true free will? If all of your choices are absolutely set in stone, with no chance whatsoever of you deviating from what God has foreseen, then you literally cannot choose to do differently. Even if you want with every fiber of your being to choose option X, but God has foreseen you as choosing option Y, then there's no possible way that you could ever choose anything other than option Y. This precludes the possibility of free will. This means that everything that we're experiencing as our lives and choices are nothing more than a cosmic rerun. It's already happened. We're just reciting a script that's already been written. This is one of a myriad of examples of Christians wanting to have their cake and eat it too. Oh yes, sure, God knows everything that will ever happen and every choice you will ever make. But that doesn't mean that you aren't free to choose whatever choices that you want. Yes, it does. If there's no chance of me not choosing option Y, then you can't say that I'm free to choose not Y. I would only be having the illusion of choice, which is most definitely not actual free will. Free will, true free will, is impossible under the idea of a Christian God.
Well, first of all, through God, all things are possible, so jot that down.
But also understand this, and I got this from Dennis Prager.
Are you okay?
I'm fine. I just threw up in my mouth a little bit.
We as Christians, or Jews, we have to explain the problem of evil. We also have to explain natural disasters. That's a toughie. Atheists, they have to explain everything else.
Once again, with the bait and switch. Kirk pays a little bit of lip service to the idea that, as theists, they have to explain the problem of evil and explain natural disasters, which he admits is tough to do, but then he pivots away from any attempt at explaining those very things. Remember, he's supposed to be explaining why he believes in God, which by his own admission would require explaining evil and, in this case, natural disasters, but then refuses to do exactly that. Instead, again, pivoting to what atheists have to do, flipping the burden of proof and setting not only believing in God, but his preferred version of the Christian God as the default standard in lieu of atheism proving itself to his satisfaction.
If you are out there and you look at this and you are angry and you are mad and you are upset at this horrific act of evil, I would just say, how do you know it's evil? By what standard do you know is it evil?
I'm glad you asked.
Because, as we went over at length just a few minutes ago, all one needs is some standard of right and wrong, regardless of where that standard comes from. And, as we've already established, everyone chooses their standard of right and wrong, good and evil, based on their personal preferences. Even the deeply religious do this. So, personally, as an atheist, I don't believe in an afterlife. I believe that this life is all that any of us get. And as such, that makes this life immeasurably precious. And so, to prematurely end this life for anyone is as wrong can be. And I get there to that notion because of my capacity for empathy. Something that Charlie Kirk rather famously didn't believe in and thought was overall a bad thing. Well, I don't think being able to recognize the pain and suffering of others and wanting to alleviate or minimize it or stop it from happening altogether based on the reciprocal idea that I wouldn't want it done to me, so why would I want it to happen to others, is a bad or damaging thing. I believe that one of the cardinal problems we have in society today is a general lack of empathy, and that society as a whole would flourish to a much greater degree, as well as would the lives of all members of that society, if everyone had a little more empathy for their fellow man. But yes, because I can empathize, and I wouldn't want my immeasurably precious life to be prematurely ended, I can rationalize that it shouldn't happen to others either. Therefore, it is wrong or evil to do so. Conversely, I can't see how someone with a truly biblical view of morality, and whose entire notion of right and wrong is based on what their faith teaches, could possibly think that the violence like that was done at Annunciation Catholic Church was such a horrible wrong as Kirk admits to believing. Not when that Christian faith teaches that it's right and good for many children to be mauled to death by bears for the horrid offense of making fun of someone for being bald. Because I guarantee you that every child in the world today has ridiculed others to a similar or worse degree than that, pretty much on any day ending in Y. No, you don't find the death or harming of children to be wrong because the Bible tells you so. You do so because of a number of things that have nothing to do with your faith. Like the evolutionary imperative to protect children from harm to thereby safeguard the next generation to carry on the species. Or the cultural expectation that the weak and vulnerable should be tended to, which is the same reason why you'll go out of your way to help the elderly pick up their groceries if they drop them, or help a person in a wheelchair who's struggling to open a door, when you might not do the same for a person who's more than capable of doing those things for themselves. Or even because of your inherent empathetic motivations that exists in all people, even those who claim to eschew such notions. Humans didn't get where they are today because we could just brush aside our innate desire to care about one another. That is actually what is built into us. But it wasn't a supernatural deity writing it into our hearts. It was just an evolutionary advantage that made us successful in our cooperative efforts that became inextricably built into our instinctive nature.
And you know it because you're appealing to Christian ethics or Jewish ethics or Judeo-Christian ethics in that regard.
Another regular Christian apologist line of bullshit that is far too frequently regurgitated. This idea that caring about one another in a society, not wanting people harmed, not wanting people stolen from, defrauded, screwed over, or to experience suffering, that it all originated from, as he said, Judeo-Christian values. Yep, totally. Before Judaism and Christianity came around, everyone was just out there killing with reckless abandon, stealing whatever they could get their grubby little hands on. Nope, there were no cities or communities where people could work together and live peacefully next to one another because everyone was just opportunistic, hedonistic monsters who would just as soon spit in your eye as shake your hand. I mean, this is ridiculous. I mean, Hinduism predates the formation of Judaism by at least 500 years, and Hinduism teaches, as part of its central tenets, the idea of dharma. Dharma being the moral and ethical foundation that upholds cosmic order and individual well-being. Dharma is intrinsically linked to something more people might be familiar with, the idea of karma. By living a life that aligns with your dharma, you create good karma, which in turn leads to a better future, both in this life and in future reincarnations. Conversely, acting against your dharma creates negative karma. So being kind, helping others, or doing what we today would consider to be good things increases one's positive karma, while harming, killing, stealing, lying, etc., that all increases negative karma. Seems very close to the same as those Judeo-Christian values, but the Hindu stuff came before. So, are you sure Christianity and Judaism aren't stealing from Hindu values? Or even others that came before that? I mean, obviously, ancient cultures like Egyptian or Sumerian or Mesopotamian cultures had societies that worked and thrived in their time, and codes of conduct that precluded things like killing one another, harming one another, stealing from one another within their communities. These practices obviously didn't come out of Christian or Jewish tradition, as those wouldn't have existed for thousands of years yet. No, as it turns out, literally every so-called Judeo-Christian value are concepts and values that predate Judaism and Christianity, and can be traced back to the very beginnings of human civilization, and arose out of simple cultural evolution, as spurred on by evolutionary psychology. Those values proved to be advantageous to us as a species, and so natural selection selected for those traits and beliefs. Put simply, those values worked for us, so we kept them. And then, a few 100,000 years later, Judeo-Christian knobs started insisting that their faith invented them, and everyone who applied such practices are stealing from their faith, and therefore believing in their faith and their God without realizing it. Dude, seriously, fuck off with that shit.
Secondly, the atheist has to explain everything else around us. They have to explain life. They have to explain the longest sentence ever recorded, which is DNA. They have to explain the fine-tuning of the universe. They have to explain why the Earth exists. They have to explain physics. They have to explain the laws of reason. They have to explain the law of thermodynamics. They have to explain it all, and they have to say, oh, it's all just an act of randomness.
It's not just atheists who have to explain all of that. It's literally anyone who wants to understand the world around us. Because you see, God did it is not an actual explanation for anything. It's an abdication of answering those questions. It's a non-answer. The classic questions are who, what, when, where, why, and how. But God did it, even if it were a true statement, would only answer one of those questions, the who. And frankly, it's the least important one. If we're exploring things like the fundamental values of the universe, say, like the gravitational constant or the speed of light, the vastly more important questions would be, what are they? Why are they the way that they are? How did they get the values that they have? When could they have ever changed? Where did they originate? Etc. None of which are satisfied by simply saying, God did it. Even the most religious people understand this, which is why many of the greatest scientists have been people of faith, and many of the greatest discoveries in human history have come because those people of faith weren't satisfied with just the answer of, God did it. Humans have an innate desire to learn and understand the nature of the universe that we inhabit. And without that need to explain everything, that knowledge never would have grown beyond, hey, what's that bright ball in the sky? Well, it must be a god flying across the sky every day. No need to look into it any further. The entire reason you know that it's actually a giant ball of gas undergoing nuclear fusion 93 million miles away is because a great many people, both theist and atheist alike, who weren't satisfied not understanding exactly what the sun was and exactly why and how it does what it does. So, as atheists, we don't have to explain all of these things in order to be an atheist. An atheist can simply say, I don't know, to any question that you ask them, and their non-belief in God is still rock-solidly valid. But anyone who wants to understand why things are the way they are, believer or not, needs to look into the still unsolved mysteries of reality. And anyone who wants to even approach the correct answer needs to do so starting from a place of not assuming that any of it is the magical machinations of a supernatural deity just doing stuff in absolute defiance of natural laws. Also, DNA isn't a sentence. Yeah, don't think I was gonna let that little nugget slip past.
You can't read, can you?
No, I can't bloody read!
And that is about where we will leave Kirk's commentary on what he views as the failings of atheism. Once again, he never came within a country mile of even beginning to establish why he believes in a god in the first place. Just instead, leaning into the tired apologetic tactic of going on the offensive and attempting to invalidate atheism in the hopes that Christianity would win by default if he could discredit non-belief enough. But, much like how attempts to disprove evolution do not even begin to prove religious creationism, attempts to disprove atheism do not even begin to prove Christianity. Kirk admitted to having to contend with the problem of evil, but then refused to address how his theology contends with the problem of evil, instead insisting that there can't possibly be any concept of good or evil without a god to establish a transcendent standard to set morality by, all the while ignoring the fact that every modern Christian ignores that supposed transcendent standard whenever it suits them to do so, not just in opposition to their adopted morality, but actually changing their moral framework to suit their preferences and seeing what the Bible clearly laid out as acceptable as instead being morally wrong, based on nothing more than their innate desire to do so. Also, ignoring the absolute heap of various secular philosophies that do not require appealing to a god in order to establish good and evil. But hey, they must all just be stealing from Judeo-Christian values in order to make such secular moralities, right? Even though those very values predate any Abrahamic religion by several millennia. Then it was the old tried and true bullshit of absolutely reversing the burden of proof. But whereas your average apologist just insists on atheists proving that God doesn't exist in any conceivable way, shape, or form, Kirk went even further and insisted that atheists have to explain absolutely everything about the entire universe before their non-belief in God can be in any way valid, and that short of total and complete knowledge of everything in existence, that belief in God, in an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving, timeless, spaceless, formless, all-controlling, all-encompassing, alpha and omega ultimate being, should therefore be the default position.
Wow, that's a lot to take in.
Unfortunately, all of that is stymied by the fact that a perfectly acceptable answer to any and all of that is simply saying, I don't know. See, atheists are not tasked with having to answer anything to validate our atheism. How did the universal values set to what they are? I don't know, but I don't think any god did it. How did DNA become the genetic material that it is? I don't know, but I don't think any god did it. How did the Big Bang expansion begin? I don't know, but I don't think any god did it. The only thing I or any other atheist need in order to validate our non-belief in God is to not have a belief in God. It is the theistic position that entails a variety of claims that are foundational to their belief system. Claims about where life came from, where the universe came from, and specifics of how it arose. Claims about the nature of reality, all of which have to be confirmed, or else the faith that posits those claims must be recognized in whole or in part as false. Claims like a 6,000-year-old universe, or human existence being the product of a golem spell, and the first man being formed from literal dirt, and light preceding the formation of any light source, a global flood, and the propagation of mankind coming from multiple rounds of rampant incest, while simultaneously insisting on incest being a terrible evil, and so on and so forth. Claim after claim after claim that are only proven more and more false as time goes by. Which is the real reason that apologists of Kirk's ilk try so desperately to flip the burden of proof. Because they know, not deep down, but instead right at the forefront of their pea brains, that their theology has already failed that burden countless of times over. And so, with that, we'll leave Charlie and his delusions behind. While he was a bitterly disturbed man, his life never should have been snuffed out so callously. Doing so not only takes from people that most precious of things, the one life and one existence that we get to have, but it also denies even the worst of us the opportunity to change and grow and become a more empathetic person. A person who might actually go on to propagate positive change in themselves and others down the line. And that is a potential that should never be denied to anyone as it was to Charlie. And it is that loss of a chance to realize a potential for empathy, as well as for the loss of the life itself, that we should all weep for. So that is where we'll end things for today. So thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like this video, comment, and subscribe so you'll always be notified when a new video comes out. Check me out on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Patreon if you'd like to support my work directly. My Teespring if you want some Pleeky merchandise. All that link below in the description. Special shout out to my most recent super thankers here on YouTube, Salvi Mike and Autumnal Fling. And with that said, until next time, I'm Professor Plink reminding you to keep striving for greater understanding. It's the best way to get wherever you want to go.